John. Yeah, the sponsor of today's video is AudioQuest. Click the link in the description box below. Bye.
Do you like my new coffee table? It's made by PS Audio. On the top here we have the KEF KC62 subwoofer, and every time I say that I think of Casey and the Sunshine Band. This is a micro subwoofer. This is my first ever subwoofer. Normally I don't cover them. Why is that? Well, because up until very recently my room had a 35 Hertz mode problem. I've treated it somewhat with these bass traps around the room from GIK Acoustics, the same company that make the wall panels, for those that want to know that. So now I think I'm ready to tackle a subwoofer. But I've always kind of been put off by subwoofers because they're usually so bloody large, the size of coffee tables with 10-inch drivers, 12-inch drivers. But when KEF announced this little kind of micro sub, I thought, yeah, that's kind of cool. That will just tuck away pretty easily and won't physically intrude. So this thing measures roughly 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters. And if I turn it around, this thing's on wheels, you can see there's a driver this side. There's the controls, I'll come back to those in a moment. And there's a driver this side. So we've got two force cancelling side woofers, if you like. They measure 6.5 inches. But KEF have done something quite clever in here in getting these two drivers in such a small box, is that they've had the voice coils sleeve over one another. So they've got kind of sort of one almost like motor system. There are 2 amps inside, 500 watts each, class D. So these side woofers, force cancelling drivers, KEF call this uni-core, uni-UNI hyphen core. And like a lot of companies, they also have special names for other things. I'll turn it again. This surround here on the driver, it's quite hard to see, but it's called P-Flex. And that's been designed, it's almost like a sort of crumpled concertina effect, so that the driver doesn't distort or do weird things when such high pressure action is going on inside this small cube. The enclosure is extruded aluminium. Also inside here they have something called smart distortion control technology. That is essentially to compensate for the distortions that take place in such a high pressure environment. If you want to know more about the tech inside this, I've already done a podcast interview with lead designer Jack Oclee-Brown. I'll put the link here so you can dive right in. I don't want to weigh this video down with endless tech talk. There are a couple of key specifications to note, however. KEF rates the output of this subwoofer at -3 dB at 11 Hertz. They also specify that it will do a maximum of 105 dB, but we have to be careful here because we shouldn't mix those two up. It cannot do 105 dB at 11 Hertz. Now obviously, it really is a cinch to get more bass in your hi-fi system with a subwoofer like this. You can just connect the power lead here and then connect it to your amplifier or other things. We'll talk about those in a moment. But connect a sound source here, plonk it down, and off you go. And you get more bass. But there's way more to it than that. I mean, because this was my first proper subwoofer investigation, I really wanted to get into the sort of nitty-gritty of how to set this thing up, because it is really not just sort of plug and play and off you run. Not at all. There's a lot of work to be done to get this sounding good within your existing loudspeaker system. So if this is the natural roll-in of the subwoofer, so let's say it's, I don't know, like 45 or 50 hertz, it sort of starts to roll in here. And then let's say this is the natural roll-off of your loudspeakers. So behind me I've got a couple of pairs of KEFs. I'll talk about each model in a bit, but the idea is to get the sub to sort of integrate properly to this sort of point. So you, actually not this sort of point because it should be flat. So you get the sort of flat integration. So you've got to do this, and that means the point in which you tell the subwoofer to kick in, and also the loudspeakers as well, we'll come to that. With the subwoofer, we can control it here. I mean, this tells us the level at which the subwoofer, well, the frequency at which the subwoofer kind of begins to perform, if you like. And that determines how good our crossover is. That's one of the factors. Also, the gain is another factor, because obviously its volume, it's, you know, how loud it is, also impacts the result. What subwoofer manufacturers are asking end users to do is design their own crossover between the loudspeaker and the sub. But yet there is still more. Yeah, we've got another windy, sunny, cloudy day, so that's going to mess with the footage, I think, or the color temperature of the footage. Anyway, before we move on, just a couple of technical terms to cover. I showed you this, right? This is the kind of the way that these things sort of lock together to produce a crossover. And this part here is what's called a low-pass filter. So it only lets low frequencies through. So if we cross the sub over at, say, 45 hertz, and if it's 50, we're going to be up here. And if we go back down to 30, we're going to be down here. So this area is determined by the low pass filter. Similarly with our mains, the filter applied to those, again, we'll come to that, that can also change. And that's, you know, in here, that's called a high pass filter. So basically low pass filters let low frequencies through, and high pass filters let high frequencies through. Let's talk about a real world example. Behind me you see a pair of KEF's LS50 Meta. They're the blue speakers. They're a passive loudspeaker, so they need an amplifier. I'm using a Hegel H390, which is in the rack behind me. And then to connect this sub, I tap the variable pre-amplifier outputs of the Hegel and go right into here. Now we have to work out where to cross over, you know, which frequency we're going to cross over our sub at. Now according to KEF, the LS50 Meta are 6 dB down at 47 hertz. I did email Jack Oclee-Brown and said to him, like, you know, what's the best starting point frequency to integrate this sub with those Meta? And he said somewhere between 45 and 50 hertz. So we choose that on the dial here. So from a purely aesthetic standpoint, I wanted to put this sub behind the right-hand speaker. So basically take the pot plant out, put the sub in there. And that's where I started. And I used the wall setting on the DSP EQ here to compensate for it being so close to the wall, because there's a corner setting here as well. There's a room setting, and there's also an apartment setting, which just shaves off, I think, the very lowest frequencies to stop, you know, people living below you getting disturbed by your sub late at night. I have offices below me, so I'm quite fortunate in that respect. But anyway, so I started with the sub there, and because that's pretty much as far as the cables from the Hegel amp will reach, they'll go a bit further. I moved it around the area, so I moved it around the right-hand speaker. So then I put it to the left of the right-hand speaker, so on the same plane. But I was quite lucky actually, the cables would just reach so I could put this sub slap bang between the two left and right channels on the same speaker plane. And that's for me where it kind of really sort of snapped into position. And to find that position, I used a Rhythm and Sound Remixes record, which is basically dub without all the vocals. And then I actually used a bunch of other sort of records that weren't so bass heavy, just to make sure that everything else kind of sounded okay. And it really did. I mean, but this was after several days of like, move the sub a little bit this way, change the gain, change the DSP, move it again, change the gain again. Like, it was a lot of trial and error. You're probably wondering what this little black thing is here. That's the receiver of what's called the KW1, which allows for a wireless link between transmitter, so either your amp or the LS50 Wireless II, and your sub. Now, that's really useful when you want to do what's called the subwoofer crawl, because there is a technique where you put the sub in your listening position. For me, it's right here. I did this. I had to move the couch out of the way, put the sub here, plug it into the wall, socket behind Olaf there. So you put it there, and then you crawl around the floor, listening to what the bass is doing. So I actually put some of that rhythm and sound on a loop and crawled around the floor a little bit, not too much because I just felt like an idiot doing it, but I did it. And you crawl around the floor until you find a spot where you think the bass sounds, I guess, smooth, reasonably detailed, not too boomy. That's the really kind of the important thing to listen for, because over there it sounded boomy, but as I kind of came this way, it sounded less so. And again, the best spot was right in front of my sideboard between the loudspeakers. So that kind of confirmed my earlier findings of just trial and error. But again, doing the subwoofer crawl, you know, it takes time. All of these things take time. Setting up a sub, integrating it with your loudspeakers and your room takes time. Now, I knew that I got the sub dialed in properly when I couldn't really locate the source of the bass. So when I was messing around with it behind the right-hand loudspeaker, I'd be like, yeah, the bass is coming from over there. But when I had it between the loudspeakers on the same level as the loudspeakers, I was playing The Blue Room by The Orb, which has Yah Wobble on bass. And there's this big gargantuan sound. And it felt like the bass was actually coming from the LS50 Meta, which is obviously not the case, but that was the illusion it painted. Now you're probably wondering what settings I used. Well, for my 6 meter by 5 meter room, I had the crossover set at 45, the gain at 10 o'clock, because I've got a lot of room loading here. The sun's just come out again, that's nice. And I had the DSP set at room as well, so no boundary compensation engaged. But obviously, those are the settings that work for my speakers in my room, and yours will be different. And you will have to go through the same trial and error process to get that illusion where the bass sounds like it's coming from the main loudspeakers. So what we have in this situation is called bass augmentation. So that means that the subwoofer is low pass filtered. Now the blue LS50 Meta has the UniQ driver, tweeter in the middle, mid bass driver around the outside. Notice mid bass, because its main job is to do mid range and bass. It is still doing that. It is not high pass filtered. It's still running at its natural level. I guess I won't say full range because it can't do full range because it only goes down to 47 Hertz. But we haven't done anything to the LS50 Meta. We haven't high pass filtered those at all. So we're just adding a dose of, like, I guess the bottom octave, maybe the bottom octave and a half, to the LS50's own natural reproduction of music. And I gotta say, holy it sounds amazing. So like a record like Spiritualized Laser Guided Melodies, and there's a track on here called Shine a Light, which has some really lovely slow low bass. It is actually a bass guitar, it's not synthesized, I don't think. And it just sounds glorious with all that extra weight and push underneath it. It's like putting foundations beneath a building. It's truly wonderful. And one of my first key findings of having that extra push and weight in the bottom, having that really low bass present, is that you don't need to turn up the volume on the LS50 Meta as much. You get more satisfaction at lower volume levels, even with things like Spring-Heeled Jack's 68 Million Shades, which is basically a drum and bass album from the 90s, but kind of like arty drum and bass. And I was also playing the House of Love's Butterfly album that came out in 89 or 90, and it's one of those sort of thin late 80s records, but with a bit more sort of, not actually too much, because there's not all that much information or low bass information in the recording, but it does give just an extra sort of rounding out in the bottom, which makes it sound a bit warmer, a bit richer, and a bit fuller, and just generally more enjoyable to listen to. And here's the thing, is like once the addition of a subwoofer becomes your new normal, it's really hard to go back to just running stand mounts on their own, basically your old normal. So if you're gonna get a sub, or even this one, you're gonna have to be prepared to put in some work and then be ready to never be able to go back and live without it. Because that's how I feel about this thing with the LS50 Meta. There is a school of thought that says, even in bass augmentation mode, so just with the sub low pass, no high pass on the mains on the LS50 Meta, there's a school of thought that says, with extra low frequency information present, it actually tricks the brain into thinking that maybe the soundstage is wider, or the mid-range is clearer, or there's a sort of greater top-end clarity. And I really didn't hear that at all. I just heard a better low end. And I turned the sub off for a bit, you know, for a day, and then turn it back on for a day, and no, I just didn't hear any improvements sort of above the waist, if you like. The LS50 Wireless II, they're an active loudspeaker, digitally active, they have DSP inside, streaming inside, DACs inside, so the whole thing is all self-contained. And they are sort of managed by the KEF Connect app, which I've raved about in the past, and I still think it is bloody amazing. And this app makes this subwoofer integration much more beginner friendly. So we can tell the app that we have the KC62 attached to, in my case, I had it attached to the right-hand speaker using a single RCA cable. And that is then attached to the LFE input here, which is low frequency effects. There is no filtering going on in here because the low pass filter applied to this sub is done inside the speaker. And that can be done, you know, set according to the app. So for example, default, the sub out low pass frequency is 45 Hertz. So similar to what I used manually here when I was integrating bass augmentation with the LS50 Meta. The app allows us to mess around with that filter setting from the listening position and also sub gain. You can see the default here is 5 dB. So we can sit here, we don't need to kind of keep standing up, going to the sub, making a tweak, sitting down again. We can make all the changes here, which I think is really, yeah, it's very beginner friendly. But here comes the difference between LS50 Meta integration and LS50 Wireless II integration. There is a setting here, high pass frequency. Default is 70 Hertz. See that? And that's a high pass filter being applied to the mid bass driver on the LS50 Wireless II. So that mid bass driver is no longer being asked to do anything really below 70 Hertz. So we're taking some of the low frequency bass burden away from the LS50 Wireless II because this guy is handling that crossed over. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, why is it 45 Hertz for the sub and 70 for the LS50 Wireless II? Why is it not the same? Well, I guess if it was the same, we'd be crossing over here and we would get some summing in the middle and we get a bump. So because obviously they sort of fade in slowly here and fade in slowly here. This is why it needs to be crossed here. And then we get a little bit of summing here to make it flat. Now that matters to music that we play, like LCD Sound System's American Dream. With the LS50 Wireless II in this sub, the mid-range does change because of the high-pass filtering. And it does sound more open, more expressive. The soundstage height goes a bit higher. Height goes higher. Basically, vocals and mid-range pop forward a lot more. So it's different to integrating with the LS50 Meta and the Hegel amp. I'll come back to some other comparisons about the two a bit later on. And then playing something like Trent Moller's The Last Resort, which has a lot of bass in it and on some tracks, it just, because the LS50 Wireless II is high pass filtered, it just doesn't sound like it's trying so hard to do everything. It doesn't sound like it's sort of revving its engine so hard. So it just sounds a bit more easeful relative to running the LS50 Wireless II solo. And obviously we still get all that extra low end, bottom octave and a half action that just, it just sounds fantastic. It's not that it kind of necessarily punches you hard. It just makes everything sound bigger and fuller, like more like a wall of sound. It really does transform both of these speakers, but with the LS50 Wireless II, we get the extra benefit of high pass filtering, which translates to a better mid-range, better soundstage height, and just more ease from that Unique driver. And that greater clarity in the mid-range and dynamic snap also translates to music that doesn't really have a lot of low frequency information, like Robin Hitchcock's I, which is a solo album from the late 80s, which is mainly acoustic guitar and piano with some acoustic bass. And where that acoustic bass goes low, yeah, we feel it, but the whole thing sounds more open with the sub integrated and the high pass filter engaged on the LS50 Wireless II. Is this making sense? I hope it's making sense. God, yeah. So as a first subwoofer investigation, this finding about high pass filtering of the mains really surprised me. I wasn't expecting this. I was expecting it to be all about low end, as many people do with, adding a subwoofer to their system. And the home theater guys will be all over this already, because many AVRs give us the option to high pass filter our main stereo speakers, but this is not as common in the hi-fi world, and obviously the Hegel doesn't allow us to do that. Now there is a high pass filter set of dip switches here, but I haven't got that far yet. I don't know what these can do to other setups, because basically you then have to route the signal out of here, then back into your amp. So it comes out of the amp into here, high pass filter, and then out of there. And this review has already taken me like 4 or 5 weeks of just solid listening and moving things around. I'd spent like a week and a half just setting the sub up and finding its best position. But this high pass filter finding is killer for me. So basically adding the KC62 to the LS50 Meta, the blue ones, is really, really good. But adding it to the LS50 Wireless II is truly outstanding. The twist in this tale is a little bit spicy, because if you ask me which of the two systems behind me I preferred to listen to for the long haul, so basically LS50 Meta powered by the Hegel H390 with this sub versus the LS50 Wireless II with this sub, I prefer the Hegel with the passive, even though the mid-range improvements brought by this are just not there as they are with the LS50 Wireless II. Why is it? Why do I prefer the Hegel thing? The Hegel thing. It's because the top end is smoother, basically. The Hegel amp just allows me to relax more into music than the amplifiers inside the LS50 Wireless II. Obviously, that is qualified by the fact that the Hegel sells for $5,000. So what we're talking about here is subjectively best, if you like, where that top end treble response becomes a factor for you, because I just think the tweeter and the LS50 Wireless II in the long run it has a good amount of air buy, but in the long run it becomes a little bit more tiring more quickly. So, but it's still by far the best value. I mean, if you get a pair of LS50 Wireless II at €2,500, this sub, so another 15, so you got a $4,000 system. You get the satellite subsystem. It's the best value by far. And I even prefer it to the Buchart A500. And that's because with the LS50 Wireless II and this sub, we get better mid-range than the Buchart. So it pops more. It steps forward into the room, whereas with the Buchart, it's a bit more standoffish. And also with the sub, we get lower bass, we get sort of greater sort of push from the low end, but we do have to work harder for it, because with the Bucharts, we just set them up and we go. And with this, as we know, we have to move it around, we have to mess around with the gain setting, the crossover setting, we have to dial it in. Well, actually in this particular case, using the app. Don't know why I pointed to those there, because we use the app to do that, to integrate this sub with the LS50 Wireless II. So I guess my conclusion is if you're prepared to put in the work, whichever sort of system or type of system you choose to integrate this sub with, you're going to get significant benefits. Now, obviously, this is my first subwoofer, so there are no comparisons to other subwoofers. And whilst I'm asking you to keep your whataboutism in check, no, I have not tried this with any other speakers than you see behind you, just the two KEFs. This took me weeks. I guess that speaks to the amount of effort you have to put in to integrate this. And if you're going with the LS50 Wireless II, I thoroughly recommend spending the €150 on this transmitter receiver system, because it just makes positioning a lot easier, then you're not tethered to cables as much. Only mains cable matters then. But this Wi-Fi pairing between sub and mains introduces a 17 millisecond delay, which is about 5 meters, like having the sub 5 meters behind the mains. And you don't want that because you don't have proper time alignment. So what KEF have done is they've delayed the mains output by 17 milliseconds. Now that has a very, very tiny impact on sort of home theater configuration. So if you're watching TV and you're really obsessive about lip sync, then you might notice it's ever so slightly out, just slightly. I mean, I really don't care that much at that level. I mean, when it gets to sort of 40 milliseconds, I begin to kind of really notice it, but at 17, not so much. But I need to point that out because some of you might be going, well, when I get a 2.1 sort of music and TV system, and that lip sync thing might trouble some people. The other thing that I found a little bit baffling is that you look at the sub in the room and it has the front face facing forwards. But a reviewer friend of mine suggested that I just turn it so that this driver is facing forwards and the other one is firing at the front wall. And it really did help give me that last little bit of extra, I guess, system lock, as in this integrating better with the mains. It just had everything just snap into place a little bit more. Just a smaller amount. Not a huge difference, but so it's worth experimenting with the orientation of this sub once you've found the position. But obviously finding the position is more important than worrying about these sort of last minor details. But this is something I discovered, so I thought I'd share it in this video. Either way, I don't think anybody buying a KC62, especially with KEF loudspeakers, is going to be disappointed. Not at all. You might be frustrated initially in having to move it around and adjust the settings. Oh, they're on the side here now. But once you get it locked in, my God, It really is truly spectacular. It's really cool. But obviously I've spent time making sure that my room is a little bit more agreeable to frequencies below 40 Hertz. So that's also a factor. But if you like this video, and I'm sorry that the color temperature keeps changing because of the weather today, but if you can ignore that and you like this video, you found it useful, then please hit the like button here. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio, in that I'm not afraid to experiment, I'm not afraid to say this is my first time, because up until today I was effectively a subwoofer virgin. If you like that kind of attitude, then please subscribe to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.